All right, our next set of notes is over speciation. I mentioned it before when we talk about natural selection and populations with dealing with genetics. Speciation is the creation of a new species. Well, first off, you have to ask what is a species, and there are lots of theories. If you talk to different types of biologists, you're going to get different answers, but the most common answer is the biological species concept, which states that a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That means they're able to produce new offspring within their group. If an individual does it, no big deal. It's about the species, about the group. Things like ligers and things like that are not a true species because they themselves cannot reproduce. They're infertile, so they don't fall in the category found as oddities. So what can create speciation? What kind of things influence that? Physical and geographical barriers. If I have over time, a large geographical thing that shows up in between a species range, it can affect that population. So all of a sudden you had a big forest, they cut down a big path through it. People don't think it's a big deal. Even birds will fly across the road, but some bird species won't leave the trees. They don't want to go out into open spaces because it's dangerous. So they won't fly across open spaces over time. They start to diverge. So in this case here, I have a forest, I have frog species, and they make a cutting here, and basically this is a little road coming through this area here. And over time, on one side you get a mutation, a yellow frog species, or yellow frog mutation shows up on this side, but not on this side. As things keep changing over time, eventually this side becomes almost all yellow frogs, this side is all green frogs. Even though they theoretically could reproduce with each other, they may not because they may not recognize each other, so they've now effectively become a new species. They've separated themselves based upon those traits from a physical barrier. Something like the Grand Canyon is a great example of that. Over time, you had species that were split and they developed differently on both sides of the canyon. Reproductive isolation. Some organisms refuse to basically reproduce even though they live near each other because of traits. Some female birds may only like males that can do a certain dance and they don't like the other ones, and other females like the males that do a different dance. And over time, those groups diverge into separate ones, or certain ones only mate with animals that eat certain fruits that they eat, and they won't mate with the other ones that eat different fruits. So there's lots of factors like that that play a role, and basically the females usually choose the mates and cause these isolational events. Change in chromosome numbers. If you have a mutation that causes a chromosomal change, all of a sudden they can no longer mate, produce fertile offspring, they become a separate species. Again, in animals we don't see it very often. Plants it definitely can happen, it can occur. There are different types of speciation events. There are three main types. Sympatric works like this. You may have a concept like this where all of a sudden you had one population, but they started selecting each other based upon a trait that they like, a coloration pattern. So eventually you created two separate populations within the same basic area. Even though they live in the same area, they self-isolate themselves into their own groups. Over here, it might be something as simple as this. These flies all originally were living on red fruit, but some of them started to only prefer to eat on the green fruit, lay their eggs on the green fruit, so therefore they only mated with flies that were on green fruit. And so they separated into separate groups over time to now they become separate fly species. Allopatric speciation. Great example is the Grand Canyon, geographic isolation. Over time, there's originally one species that went across the area, and as the Grand Canyon formed, it separated two squirrel species into separate groups. So now you end up with two that look similar, but they're not exactly the same anymore. They no longer can interbreed with each other. They are actually separate species. On both sides of the Grand Canyon, two types of squirrel species. Parapatric speciation, a little bit more complicated, because you start with the original species that has a lot of variation through over a wide range, but it starts to separate into variation as a gradient. So in one part of the range, they're almost all green, but there's a little bit of the darker green. The next following the range, you get a little bit darker and darker blues. Theoretically, they're all one species, but these guys don't recognize these guys and vice versa, but these guys recognize these guys and reproduce, and so forth and so on, all around the whole range. So there's still interbreeding going on, but only within ones that are nearby each other. So they're next to each other, but they're not quite the same. As they spread out, they get too different. So think of it this way. Sympatric, they're all about the same area. Parapatric, there's only some overlapping with each other, but the other ones are a distinct group, and then the allopatric are completely separated from each other. A special case of sympatric is what's called a ring species. As the name implies, they actually go all the way around a range till they form back up. When the two ends meet, they no longer recognize each other. They basically have decided they are no longer the same and they won't reproduce. Obviously, the biggest ring would be around the world. So some species do go around the world, but as they come back together, they don't interbreed anymore. Like this. This is the northern hemisphere here, and it's a gull species. As they've traveled around, they're separated. Basically, the herring gull goes this way, and these guys will breed and breed. These guys will 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 breed. But these two will not breed. So they separate each other as they go around by small little traits. Same thing happened in California with a number of types of salamanders. As the salamanders have spread across the different valleys here, they can breed next to each other, but as they go further along, they won't interbreed anymore. They basically separate each other based upon slight differences with each other. How fast does speciation occur? That's always a big question. There's a couple of different competing theories. First one's called gradualism. As the name implies, it goes gradually over time. Small little changes until eventually you have separate species. And the other one's called punctuated equilibrium, which basically states you have a period of nothing happening and then rapid change, and then nothing happening and then rapid change, punctuated equilibrium. Which theory is right? There's evidence to both sides. Could be the fact that maybe both of them play a role and they both have differences based upon the environmental cues. So some of them are things like gradualism. You have slight changes occurring slightly over time until eventually you have two separate species. Or you have one where nothing happens and then boom, a change, and then nothing happens and then boom, a change, and so forth and so on, until eventually you have multiple different species from one species. There are examples again for both these, things like the finches in the Galapagos Islands probably play something similar to this, whereas some of the other ones may be a little different than this one here, where you're seeing slight changes over time and they basically separate and diverge.